with great pleasure that we introduce Alex McAuley this evening.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much to everybody for joining us this evening. If there are any technical issues, just give me a hand sign and we should go on from there. It's a great pleasure to see you all, of course. A shame that we can't be meeting in person, whoever needs must, and thank you for your time and your attention this evening in advance. My topic this evening is Christ in context, and what I really mean by this and what I want to talk about is everything that isn't written down in the Gospels. And hopefully considering the context in which Christ lived, hopefully considering the background of the texts themselves, will then not only give us a fuller understanding of the Gospels and a better sense of how to approach Lent this year, but indeed, I think will prefigure our approach to the World Leprosy Day appeal in 2022. Why does this matter, and what do I mean by the unwritten context? Well, I'll use a contemporary example. Let's say that you were sending an email or a message to a friend of yours about what you had done over Christmas or a recent trip that you've taken. If you were writing this message, you would not say, well, I turned left and then drove down the left-hand side of the road. I stopped at red lights. I went at green lights, hopefully. And indeed, unless you're Father Sebastian or myself recently that you've slowed down for speed cameras, again, there are so many basic elements of everyday life that are just so common knowledge, that are so commonly known that we don't really need to mention them. And this is precisely what I want to reach into this evening with you. Take, for instance, this passage from the Gospel of Matthew, which I think fits quite well with our World Leprosy Day appeal for this year. When Jesus came down from the mountainside, large crowds followed him. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus reached out his hand to the man and said, "I am willing." And he said, "Be clean." And immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. Then Jesus said to him, "See that you don't tell anyone, but go show yourself to the priests and offer the gift that Moses commanded as testimony to them." Story also shows up in Mark 1 and elsewhere in Luke. But from our perspective here in 2022, I think that we have a tendency to read this type of gospel story as a healing miracle. One in which Christ saw the physical infirmity, the disease, the malady of somebody who asked his assistance, and then Christ gave it, and the individual was miraculously cured in a physical sense. But in its ancient context, in its first century background, this is a revolutionary act, and there is a great deal of subtext and a great deal of social context to this event that I think casts it in a very different light. When we think of the Gospels, when we interact with the Gospels, I think we have a tendency to view them on the one hand as stories that we know and events that we're familiar with, but also something that is alien, distant, very difficult to actually visualize. And indeed, I think we forget that the Gospels played out in a specific historical and geographical context. So take, for instance, this photograph of the contemporary town of Nazareth. When we read of Nazareth, this place in which Christ spent much of his youth and his early ministry, we can oftentimes forget that this is a location in modern day Israel in the north of it, one that was set in a certain geographical and topographical background, and indeed a place with its own local history. Here you see the town today. You can see here at the bottom the Basilica of the Annunciation, and then just to the left here is a car park where, even though last time I visited was a time of profound upheaval and unrest, I still managed to get a ticket from the Israeli government. So some aspects of society continue to function. In the same vein, here is Jerusalem today. When we think of Jerusalem, we think of the Temple Mount, we think of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, we think of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. But again, today, this is a specific city in an actual geographical location in its own topographical context. So what I want to do this evening is I want to reach behind, to look behind, as it were, the text of the Gospels and find a glimpse of the world in which they were written, a world in which Christ lived and moved and had his being. And then hopefully through this combination of text of the Gospels and social context, we can have a fuller sense of just what many of these narratives mean. And then hopefully we'll be able to take away a few lessons about how we can approach our own relationship with them and the upcoming events of this year's World Leprosy Day appeal. So the itinerary for this evening is in three parts. Number one, we're going to set the stage and look at ancient Judea in Rome, Greece, and in between. Then we're going to switch to life in Galilee, in Christ's neighborhood, as it were, at the time of Christ. And then we're going to end with two concepts that are fundamental to ancient society, that are deeply interrelated and yet remarkably alien to us. So first, to set the stage, well, to really understand the world of 0 AD, to really understand the world in which Christ lived, we need to reach back a little bit further, about 3.5 centuries, to the campaigns of Alexander the Great. At the end of the 330s into the 320s, over a period of 9 years, this Macedonian king, Alexander the Great, conquered the swath of territory that you see highlighted here on your screens on this map. A massive, vast domain that was remarkably conquered in a very short amount of time, 9 million or so square kilometers. But more importantly, this territory that you see highlighted was the home to vastly divergent and diverse ancient cultures and societies. Now, in the context of Judea that you see highlighted here on the map in red, the salient point for us is that as a result of the conquest of Alexander the Great, suddenly this entire region became one in which suddenly Greek culture, Greek language, Greek society became dominant. It became the elite culture for the first time in these regions' history. And on a practical level, in this period, in the centuries leading up to the birth of Christ, from modern day Greece through Egypt, all the way to the Hindu Kush, Uzbekistan, and modern day Afghanistan, these diverse ancient cultures came into face-to-face contact with Greek culture for the first time. And it's how this interaction played out that really is the story of the Hellenistic period. Judea in the centuries leading up to Christ was then, as it is now, a key strategic buffer zone. So it's of course located between Egypt, the gateway to the Arabian Peninsula, the Mediterranean coast, and Syria. And so then, as now, it is situated at a strategic crossroads. In antiquity, especially during the Hellenistic period, Judea is a key buffer zone between the Seleucid Empire of Syria and the Ptolemaic Empire of Egypt. And as a result of this, it changed hands frequently and was the site of fairly frequent warfare. Both of these empires, though, as part of their imperial project, in the centuries leading up to Christ, they built new city foundations along the Syrian coast and into Judea and Egypt. And these were Greek-style cities with Greek communities, Greek institutions, Greek architecture, Greek language, and perhaps most importantly, populated by imported Greek populations. So again, here as elsewhere, Greek and non-Greek culture come face to face with one another in a very intimate way. In Judea, however, this cultural contact created a deep division in Judea among the Hellenistic Jews themselves between, on the one hand, the Hellenizers, those of the priestly elite and later the royal elite who wanted to adopt and imitate Greek culture for strategic and economic and political benefit. And then on the other hand, those who resisted this and those who said that no, actually, Greek culture is incompatible with the law and the exigencies of the Torah. And this leads to civil strife, civil war, and an ongoing debate up to the time of Christ. Now, in the decades leading immediately up to the birth of Christ, Judea had by this point become first an independent kingdom and then transitioned to being a client kingdom of Rome. Now, this played out against a backdrop of deep and bloody unrest and civil war, both in Judea itself and in the broader Roman world. So the generation really before the birth of Christ would have had this immediate memory of civil strife and tension and warfare and loss. But by 0 AD, suddenly Judea is part of this broader Roman imperial constellation that you see highlighted here on the map in green. So Judea is part of a Roman imperial system that stretches from Britain and Spain all the way to Iran and to Iraq, an expanse of territory roughly 5 million square kilometers and a population of between 55 and 65 million people, or between 75 and 85, according to a little bit more recent estimate. But at the very least, this gives you a sense of, at the time of the birth of Christ, this broader imperial system of which Judea, of which Israel was a part. Now, Roman Judea, which you see indicated here on the map, was a province of the Roman Empire. And as a result of that, there are really three key groups, key political groups, whom we see appear fairly frequently in the different gospel narratives. And they really define the power balance in the region at the time. We have the Romans, the imperial occupiers, people like Pontius Pilate, imperial officials and military officials. We have the Herodians, the client king of Rome, his supporters, his court, and his dynasty. And the temple priests, these priestly families that had been the dominant religious authority in the region for centuries by this point. The other key group we see show up fairly frequently in the Gospels are the tax collectors. Now, when we think of tax collectors, we think of someone from HMRC who shows up on our doorstep and demands settlement for the 20, 30, 40% that we owe to the government. But in the Roman world, the system works differently. Publicani is the Latin term for tax collectors. And the way tax collection works in Rome is that an individual will offer a lump sum of money upfront to the Roman government, say 500,000 denarii. In return for that lump sum payment, they are given the right and the authority to collect taxes in a certain geographical area. So the way that they make their money is by eking out as much currency, resource, and oftentimes labor from the population as humanly possible. So this not only creates a system of exploitation, but it also leads to regular and frequent extortion. Hence the negative image of the tax collectors in the Gospels. But we're going to continue to zoom in here. So in the map here, you see highlighted in blue the region of Galilee. And this is really Christ's neighborhood. It contains Nazareth, it's where he grew up, it's where much of his early ministry took place. And Galilee in the time of Christ on a geographical level was not really dissimilar from what you see here in this photograph. This is the modern town of Kfar Cana, which is the modern location of Cana, the village at which the famous wedding of Cana took place. And Galilee really has two different geographical zones, just to help you wrap your heads around the physical areas here. On the one hand, in the west, we have these fairly rocky, mountainous, grassy hills that are not completely intemperate, but also not particularly good for sedentary agriculture. Again, you can see this in the background here at Cana. And then in the east, as you see here highlighted on this satellite photograph, is a region of gently sloping plains that lead down from the mountains toward the Sea of Galilee. Now, these are dry, arid, but fairly gentle and easy landscapes to navigate. And then you see here, this body of water is the Sea of Galilee itself, Lake Kinneret, as it's known to the modern Israelis. The ancient geography of settlement is again not that different from it is today. Here you see the Google Maps version. Major settlements at the time of Christ, or at least the major ones of importance to us, are Tiberias, the city on the coast that we're going to see in just a moment, at least in the east, and the Sea of Galilee. In the center, Nazareth, where Christ himself grew up. Here you see Cana, just a little bit to the north. And then the Roman imperial town, the regional capital of Caesarea, which is a port on the Mediterranean. Now, Galilee at the time of Christ was not a particularly big place. It had between 10 and 15,000 people under Herod Antipas, King Herod, in the nativity narratives. And Herod, in the years preceding the birth of Christ, had just recently built Tiberias as a port city. Now, Tiberias is a Roman city, a typical Roman city. It has Roman architecture, a grid pattern, Roman-style houses, theaters, paved roads, temples of the imperial cult, all that we expect as a miniature version of Rome that it was meant to be. But this means that with the creation of the city of Tiberias, in the time of Christ, there is a tension between the rural, small, village-centered culture of the region, especially inland, and these new imperial constructions. So it's almost as if suddenly the Roman Empire had come into the background or the backyard of Galilee. Here you see the town of Galilee today as it appears on the coast of the Sea of Galilee. It's an absolutely beautiful resort town, one that's a bit of a hidden gem, but very popular among the Israelis over the summer. Here you see the town itself. This is the western edge of the Sea of Galilee, and then the north itself. Now, I wanted to show you this for two reasons. Number one, to show you where Tiberias is today. And number two, to give you a sense of the relatively small scale of the Sea of Galilee. This is not a sea on the size of the Mediterranean. It's a lake, realistically. And you see here the northern edge of it. That's only really about 3 kilometers away from Tiberias. So we're not dealing with a particularly massive place. Here's Tiberias looking towards the south. Again, you see these sloping hills and then these mountainous regions that I mentioned earlier. Here is the city of Tiberias as it appears at night. And actually just behind this big shopping mall in the foreground here is a giant McDonald's sign. So globalization is a wonderful thing, even in the Golan Heights. Again, to give you a sense of the countryside, here's the Orthodox monastery of the Seven Apostles as it stands today. You see these grassy lands heading towards the Sea of Galilee. And again, the other side of the Sea of Galilee is not particularly far away, as this photograph captures. Here's a view from the north looking south. Again, you see these different geographical zones. Would have been much more arid in antiquity, not quite as good irrigation, but still gives you a sense. And then just in the center left of the photograph here, you can see this group of buildings. Now that is the town of Capernaum. Capernaum is the home of St. Peter and the first apostles. It's the place in which Christ summoned the first apostles to his service. Capernaum, as it stands today, here you see the modern museum, and then this large structure here is the Hellenistic Roman synagogue, and then we have the leftover bits of houses surrounding it, and then here's the car park off to the side. Not a particularly big place. It is a decent sized village, population of about 1,000 to 1,500 people. And here's an image of Capernaum as it would have been in antiquity at the time of Christ, at the time of the Gospels. A couple of things to note. Number one, big synagogue in the middle of the village, indeed, as you saw previously. The other thing to note is just how closely packed everyone was, and just how intimate this settlement pattern was. It's a very nucleated settlement pattern. So for 1,000, 1,500 people, this is a very small scale world. And then of course, here you have the fishing boats on the coast. Now, as I mentioned, in Galilee itself, in the time of Christ, building of cities had fundamentally changed the economic landscape, and it created the potential of exploitation of the countryside as larger amounts of land are concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer people. In Tiberias and elsewhere, we see at the time of Christ this importation of a new urban elite. Now, these are largely supporters of Herod, and they're largely from Jerusalem, but their presence in Galilee had relatively recently led to highly increased stratification of wealth. So at the time of Christ, the gap between the urban rich and the rural poor is getting wider and wider and wider. It's a time of almost no social mobility. And as a result of this economic reality, we see the prominence of debt, especially among the rural population. We see urban poverty, people who have lost their land and seek either work or support in the city, and exploitation and taxation. To give you a sense of the demography of the world of Galilee, we can use this comparative data from the Roman Empire. Now, we don't have figures that are reliable enough for Galilee itself, but nevertheless, I think this slide gives you a sense of just how difficult and how arduous life was in the Roman Empire at the time of Christ. We have a tendency, I think, to view antiquity with rose-colored glasses, but I think this shows the reality of it in no uncertain terms. In the Roman imperial period, 1st century AD, roughly half of all people born in the Roman Empire died before the age of 5. So we're looking at an infant mortality rate of between 50 and 60%. Roughly half of those who survive would die by the age of 50. So someone who is considered to be long-lived would be someone who was in their 50s, early 60s, maybe at a push. And on the whole, we're looking at an average life expectancy of between 20 and 30. Now, on population replacement terms, the Roman Empire had a general fertility rate of between 4.5 and 6.5 children over a woman's lifetime. However, that's just the base rate. When we add in high rates of widowhood and infertility, we're looking at 6 to 9 children over the course of a woman's lifetime. And that's not to increase the population, that's just for stable maintenance level population growth. Life in Galilee, then, when we look at it in sum, is remarkably difficult and remarkably arduous. And I think this is something that is critical to understanding the Gospels and the events that they describe. Galilee, on an economic level, was largely subsistence level agriculture. Most people are small scale farmers. They either own their own farms or they are tenants. So they farm their own land, they then pay their whatever taxes or rent are due, they live off of the remainder and trade for the remainder as well. And predominantly they're organized into small villages scattered in the countryside. Now, a key point that I think is quite difficult again for us to understand in the 21st century is that the vast majority of people in Galilee at the time of Christ subsist at near starvation levels. Everyone is right on the brink of starvation. Now, not only does chronic malnourishment lead to susceptibility to disease, and there's an awful lot, especially of animal to human transmitted diseases, But it also creates a precariousness that puts everyone in the Gospels right on the edge of absolute catastrophe. So if people are subsisting at near starvation levels, if there is an unexpected event, be it the death of a spouse, the death of a child, the death of a laborer, someone gets ill, if there is a bad weather pattern, if there is a particularly nasty tax collector, these are not just questions of comfort, these are questions of life and death. And again, there is no social safety net here. Low agricultural yield, unfertile terrain, extra burden of tax and tribute, and then the final point is that at the end of the day, we are looking at a society that is completely and totally dominated by the family structure. So outcasts are quite literally outcasts. There is no social services, there is no welfare, there is no NHS, there is no universal credit. So the moral of the story for me then is that we are looking at a backwater of a backwater, but most importantly, when we look at Galilee, we are looking at a small and intimate world, a very small scale local society that is driven by these two concepts with which we will close today. Number one, shame and honor on the one hand, and number two, purity and pollution on the other hand. And these concepts, I think, are as fundamental to ancient society as they are almost impossible for us to wrap our heads around today. We need to bear in mind, first and foremost, that in the ancient world, in ancient societies like those of Galilee at the time of Christ, there is no separation between public and private. Everything is out in the open. Here on the slide, you see a model of a standard Israelite household, roughly at the time of Christ, that would hold between 10 to 15 people. So it gives you a sense of the small scale of settlement. Now, in a face-to-face culture like that in Galilee at the time of Christ, the most important assets that you have as an individual are your honor. And then, of course, the antithesis of that is shame. But it's not just your individual honor that determines your place in a face-to-face culture, because we have this concept of derivative virtue. And this means that you derive your virtue, derive your honor, or indeed you inherit your shame from the conduct of those who are part of your household. So if there's a male head of a household, for instance, the behavior of his children, of his sons and daughters, of his spouse, of his slaves, this will all directly determine his standing in society. So in this small world, your reputation is everything. Your oath is your credit. And ultimately, all of this rests upon how you are perceived by those around you. Who determines this? Ultimately, it is the individuals in this society who are around you. And your honor and your shame determine quite directly to what extent you are included or excluded from society. And again, as I mentioned just a moment ago, if you are outcast, you are quite literally outcast. Closely tied to this idea of purity and pollution, to this idea of shame and honor, rather, are these concepts of purity and pollution in a religious sense. And again, this is fundamental to the social fabric of the ancient world, but something I think that really we perhaps only began to understand a little bit during the COVID pandemic. It's only when we became confronted with the realities of things like self-isolation, like quarantines, like social distancing, that we start to realize the reality of concepts of purity and pollution in the ancient world. Purity and pollution function along a spectrum. So we have polluted on the left, we have your normal everyday life here in the middle, a mixture of the two, and then ritual purity on the right, which allows you access to certain sacred spaces and events. Who determines purity and pollution? The priesthood. So in the same way as your shame and honor are determined by others, so too is your purity, and this determines whether or not you can take part in religious events. Now, what makes you impure in the society of Christ? What makes you impure in the world of the Gospels? Well, following the law of Leviticus, the following things make you ritually polluted or impure. Contact with or proximity to corpses, things that corpses have touched, carrion or sharatzim, which are certain creeping things in Hebrew, birth and miscarriage, menstruation, genital and other bodily discharges. So in other words, the tie that binds these is that the things that make you ritually polluted, the things that make you ritually impure, are precisely the reminders of our own mortality, of the fleeting and transient nature of our human existence, juxtaposed against the purity and eternity of God. And again, this determined how close you could get to religion. The final thing, though, and the point with which I want to end here, is the last thing that makes you impure is this Hebrew term, tzarat. What is tzarat? Well, tzarat was translated into Greek as lepra in the 2nd century BC. Now, this term, tzarat and lepra, is almost always translated in modern translations of the Gospels as leprosy, but it's not really Hansen's disease, as we're going to see on this slide. It's not really leprosy as we necessarily think of it. Lepros in Greek means rough, scaly, scabby, abrasive, something like this. And according to Leviticus, leprosy, or rather this tzarat, has the following symptoms. It occurs spontaneously or after a boil or abscess. It develops on the head, scalp, or the beard. It is marked by swelling, subcutaneous nodules, or cuticular crusts on your fingernails, whitish red spots on the epidermis, or by a whitish discoloration, and your body hair becomes white. Now, of course, I'll defer to the dermatologists in the room here, but the possible contemporary diagnoses for this are things like eczema, leukoderma, psoriasis, vitiligo, or related conditions, but not what we would identify as leprosy, as Hansen's disease. But I think perhaps most importantly for us, as we think about this year's World Leprosy Day appeal, is what are the causes and what is the pathology of leprosy in ancient society at the time of Christ? Well, the word in Hebrew for leper, mezorah, is linked by the rabbinical tradition to this Hebrew term mosishem ra, which means slanderer or liar. Leprosy, or tzarat, was not a disease that you contracted because of a lack of hygiene or because of bodily transmission, but rather it is a disease that you contract as divine punishment for sin, specifically for the sins of slander, deceit, lying, treachery, any kind of untruth. So Miriam became leprous because of her slander of Moses. Cain got it for lying about Abel. Aaron got it for slander. Joab for a treacherous murder. Uzziah for being a king who usurped priestly privileges, and the list goes on. But the most important point for us, though, is that what is identified as leprosy in the Gospels is a disease that causes pollution and illness that fundamentally is caused by shame. So it deprives someone of their honor. It makes them a walking corpse, not only in the ritual purity versus polluting sense, but also in the shame and honor sense. It's a bit of a double condemnation, as it were, of a person's body and character. And the result of this is that they were segregated and not allowed into the community until they were purified. So with all of this in mind, then, we come back to this passage of Matthew with which we began. And as I hope to have shown over the last slides of my presentation, when we see Christ coming up to a leper, he's not just performing a work of corporeal mercy. He is quite literally reaching out to somebody who is outcast, who is doubly shamed, who is completely and totally anathema and excluded from society. And in the process, he's putting his own status at risk. And so, yes, there is a medical component to this, but I think more importantly, there is a moral, a spiritual, or character component to this, that when Christ heals him, he is quite literally bringing back into society. But he doesn't just stop there. And for our conclusion today, I just wanted to show you what happens next in the gospel immediately after this, because Christ comes down from the mountainside, heals the leper, and then he goes into Capernaum, which we've just seen. A centurion comes to him asking for help, and we have the famous scene of the centurion at Capernaum having his servant be healed with the words that we say at Mass all the time: Lord, I'm not worthy to have you enter under my roof, but only say the word, and my servant shall be healed. So Christ goes from interacting with a leper who is doubly outcast and doubly damned in gospel society to a Roman centurion who is not only a foreigner, who is not only ritually polluted, who is not only someone who is impure in Jewish eyes, but also someone who is an enemy of the people of Judea, someone who is an agent of imperial exploitation, the source of all of these, or at least many of these, contemporary issues and deprivations. So Christ goes right from the leper to the centurion. And so I want to leave you with two closing thoughts today as we think about how to approach our World Leprosy Day appeal for 2022. The first might be a very facile point. While this world that I've described over the last half hour or so might be something that's vastly alien to us and very difficult to imagine. This kind of society for millions of people in certain various corners of the world is very much a 21st century reality, not just in terms of honor and shame and purity and pollution, but in the sheer economic and social hardship that is a day-to-day reality. Again, for us in 2022, this might not be something that we associate with, but however, the world of the Gospels is not so dissimilar from the various corners of the world in which the Aid for the Church in Need does its work. The second, I think, is the reminder for us. Now, a priest in Washington, D.C. reminded me that whenever we read the Gospels, we always need to put ourselves in the narrative. And when we put ourselves in the narrative, either as a bystander or an apostle, or when we consider the figure of Christ itself, I think the message of all of this is remarkably clear. The gospel is ultimately the story of the breaking down of the barriers and divisions and separations within the society of its time. It is a narrative of Christ and the apostles ignoring those things that the world told them made them different and distinct and disinterested from those around them, and instead giving them a willingness and eagerness, perhaps even an obligation, to see beyond those differences and those distinctions, to look beyond these momentary separations in society. And I think this is as true of the world of the Gospels as it is of the 21st century world in which we live. Thank you very much for your time and for your attention.
Thank you, Alex. That was quite phenomenal.